Well, my first ambition was to be a doctor because I thought by being a doctor I could get my mother back her legs. And I mean, that's quite interesting because I did, in fact, become a psychoanalyst. And in a way, what you do as a psychoanalyst is you get people back on their legs.
Hello and welcome to Confessions. My name is Giles Fraser. This is the podcast where I'm joined by a distinguished guest in an attempt to find out what makes them tick. I'm going to try and drill down into their core beliefs to understand better who they are and what they're on about. And bearing their soul in the stall this week is the wonderful, wonderful Salley Vickers, who is a woman of many parts, a writer, novelist, poet, psychoanalyst, and general good egg. And
Teacher of literature.
Teacher of literature. There we are. and mother and grandmother and many things between. So the way we normally start these things, Salley, is I just talk about, to start with, I ask you about your background and where you came from and your mum and dad and your home life when you were growing up and something about that and how maybe some of your values and the things that are important to you grew out of that. So perhaps you could describe that for me just to start with.
Well, how much time have we got?
Yes.
Because I always say my parents' background is a lot more interesting than me. And I'm quite often asked why I don't write a book about it. So I'll tell you a bit about my background. My parents met in the Student Communist Party. Oh. My mother was a scholarship girl from she liked to say working class, but I would say what used to be called lower middle class, a class that's more or less disappeared, I hope. My dad came from a moneyed family. Oh. I've just looked...
But both communists?
Yes. I've just looked up his records in the National Archive, actually looking for his father's records, because his father was killed in 1916 in the First World War. And I was looking them up for my granddaughter, Rowan, who you know, who was doing a project on the First World War, as everybody is, because it's the 100 years celebration of the armistice. So looking up my grandfather, I found my father. And I find that his files are still with the National Security.
Oh, he was a person of interest.
He was down as a communist sympathiser at school.
At school?
At school, and this is confirmed in a later entry, because you get the entries, from his correspondence as a prisoner of war to his wife. In a censored letter.
At school, the government are interested in...
I know.
Oh, my word.
I knew he was in the Security Service catalogue because I knew that he had got a job at the BBC when he came home from the war. He escaped from prisoner of war camp right at the end of the war, came back, was demobbed, got a very good position at the BBC, and then suddenly it was removed from him.
That's shocking. And
he later discovered it was because he was considered a person of in danger of national security. So it's quite interesting. But the file goes on until the 1960s, when long after he'd left the Communist Party and was a trade union leader and a very, very solid supporter of the Labour Party. So that's really interesting. But it's really interesting for communist sympathies in 1934 when at school. So
that's just extraordinary.
Isn't that extraordinary?
So a teacher grassed him up, or...?
Well, he was taught by George Roudet, who was a Marxist historian who later became a world expert on the French Revolution.
Is this a sort of posh, well-known school type?
It's Stowe, which his mother always referred to as that progressive school. It all came from sending him to that progressive school.
Oh, so his mum was quite posh then?
His mum was posh. His dad was posh. They were moneyed. And I think with the death of his father, he rebelled against all that because she married again a horrible man, a horrible, snobbish, fortune-hunting man. Oh. But he was also at school with John Cornford, who was a very brilliant young man, got a scholarship to Cambridge at 16, and went off to fight the Spanish Civil War and was killed the day after his 21st birthday. Oh, my word. And I think he was the person who got Dad into the Communist Party. Anyway, that's the one long story. So he met my mum at Cambridge. She was the scholarship girl. And just before he went off to France, he enlisted in 1939, went off to France in February 1940. They got married just before in registry office, had spent their honeymoon on Cambridge Station having ham sandwiches. And he was captured in that April, and he spent the rest of the war almost in a prisoner of war camp. Meanwhile, he was reported missing, believed dead. My mother took up with his best friend.
Oh, my word, Sally.
A brilliant young physicist called Ram Nahum, who I think was the love of her life. And in July 1942, 3 bombs fell upon Cambridge, only one on a civilian house, which happened to be the house where my mother was with Ram, in bed, and he was killed on top of her. She thought she was dying because they couldn't get her out of the wreckage. And what she thought were her last known words were, "Goodbye, boys. I'm done for. Long live Stalin. Long live the party." Which is, yes, you're allowed to laugh because it's pretty grimly awful, but that should be your last words.
And was Ram her lover, I guess? Was he a commie as well?
Yes, they all were.
Right, okay.
He was rather sort of
and then
famous among the communist movement. I mean, he was sort of a well-known, rather very charismatic figure. Jewish, came from a Manchester manufacturing company family.
And she didn't know your dad was alive.
Well, she did by this time.
Okay.
But she'd fallen in love with Ram.
I see.
So Dad came back to a wife. Well, they dragged her out, but her legs were burnt off. So she had 2 artificial legs. She didn't tell him. She always said it was because she didn't discourage him, but I think it was because she'd have had to explain Ram, actually. My mother was a very interesting figure. I mean, crafty or what?
So she never said to him
No.
She never told him about this love of her life?
No, but he discovered.
I see.
I mean, he could hardly not because they were all friends. They were all in the party together. But he came back and they stayed together. And I think that was partly because he was, for all his communist sympathies, he was brought up with a code of public school honour.
So you were brought up in this house then, which there's politics. Sounds like there's secrets.
Lots of secrets. And absolute atheism, of course, which went with the communism.
I see, yes.
They left the party in 1956 when the Russians invaded Hungary. Or rather, Dad left before 1956, as it in fact says on his national security archives. My mum hung on because the communists had been incredibly good to her after she was bombed. They looked after her. They really did. I mean, they rallied round. I mean, there's much to be said for those communist sympathisers. I don't any longer agree with the politics, but I think there was something about the camaraderie. And as you and I have often said, there are a lot of associations with early Christianity.
There really are,
Radical.
Communitarian,
yes, sense of equality among everybody, sharing.
And a big picture of the world, wanting to, the idea that it wasn't just about getting on with going down the shops and doing your thing. There was some sort of great mission about.
There was a great mission, there was a great idealism, yes. So I think the sense of honour kept them together. They didn't think she could have children because her pelvis was so badly damaged. But being my mum, she was a remarkable woman, she shopped around until she found a consultant obstetrician in Liverpool, which is where she grew up. And he took her on. And although he was a private obstetrician, he delivered her under the National Health Service because I was born in 1948. So I am a baby of the National Health Service. And I was his first National Health baby, which is quite fabulous. So it was an interesting time. But, I mean, there was a lot of, as you can imagine, tension in the household.
Yes. And did you have brothers and sisters?
Later, she had my brother, but we're 6 years apart.
Okay, so it was like for a while that you were an only child.
Yes, and I was also the sort of the miracle child, the child that, I've written about this for quite a long time. I thought of Ram as my real father because she told me about him when I was much too young to understand.
I see, goodness gracious me.
I mean, how was
so there were things that you were told that you weren't allowed to tell your dad?
Yes, very much. I was her confidant and her legs, which of course was...
You were her legs?
I was her legs. She was very athletic. She was a hockey blue, a very good runner, a very good swimmer. And I've got only one picture of my mother's legs as an adult woman. There was a film made of her and her contemporaries in Cambridge, and she's diving into the River Cam, and there's a flash of her legs, and I've played that so many times just to see my mother's legs.
It's extraordinary, this is, because you and I know each other quite well.
Yeah.
And I didn't know any of this.
Well, I don't. I've learnt to talk about it more recently because I've come to think, this is my past, and I can't disown it or cover it up.
But it's also I can understand how a child who grew up in that sort of a household, I begin to get some insight of why the sort of inner life may become so fascinating and so rich and so complex.
Yes, I had a sense of both my parents' inner life. I mean, my father had an affair, and I met the woman, his mistress. I have a very vivid picture of her. She was a rather very attractive, dark-haired woman with very red lipstick. I mean, that's what I remember most. And I asked my mother about it later, and she said, yes, indeed, he had an affair. And I mean, I'm not surprised,
Yes.
Come back, find your young athletic wife with two missing legs, and you discover she's been having an affair with a man who's been your best friend. You are liable to have an affair, I think. I mean, I think the great thing he did was he stuck by her, and they did make a life of it together, and they did make eventually a very good marriage.
Okay, they were happy in some way. They found a way of being happy.
I think politics did a lot. I think their shared communism, and then their very strong shared socialism. I mean, my father was a Labour councillor, my mother was a social worker. They had this very, very strong sense of
So let's talk about you growing up here,
Okay.
and how you sort of, I don't know, how your values are being shaped at this time.
Well, my first ambition was to be a doctor because I thought by being a doctor I could get my mother back her legs. And I mean, that's quite interesting because I did, in fact, become a psychoanalyst. And in a way, what you do as a psychoanalyst is you get people back on their legs.
Yeah.
It's one way of looking at
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
Or you help people who have suffered atrocities or traumas to sufficiently come to terms with them to be able to function with luck as well as they did before, and with even greater luck, better sometimes. So I think my mother's injury certainly did that for me. It would have been impossible for me ever to marry somebody who was right-wing. I mean, I've always known that. And I can remember when I was at university being quite attracted to somebody and then discovering he voted Conservative.
That was it.
Well, it wasn't just in my head. My whole sort of sexual desire disappeared.
Oh, wow.
Which is quite interesting.
Wow.
I mean, I didn't kind of have a conflict.
Right.
My attraction to this person disappeared, which is quite interesting. But if you have a mother who, when she's dying, is not saying love to my husband or my mum or my
But to
dad,
Stalin.
saying long live Stalin, long live the party,
Yeah.
you can see that in my blood is a sense that somehow it would be a massive betrayal.
There's a lot of I know a number of children of communists from this period, and a number of them sort of really did rebel quite strongly against that background and the party and so forth. But you sort of eased away from it. Would that be right?
Well, my rebellion was religion, which you will understand.
Yes.
I mean, my mother had a story. My mother was quite a cruel person, which is understandable because she'd undergone a very cruel fate. But she could be quite cruel. She was very, very exacting of me because, I was the miracle child. And I had to both do best but not do better than her, which was a complicated
it's a
tightrope.
narrow window.
Yes, or tightrope, of course,
Yes.
is an interesting analogy.
Yes.
But I remember coming back from school and saying, "Mummy, is it all right if I pray?" And her bursting into fits of laughter. And then she went around telling people this, telling her friends.
Oh, you were derided,
Absolutely
publicly
derided.
denounced almost.
Well, I wasn't denounced. No, they didn't do denouncing. They weren't
Okay.
that bad. But in a way it was worse because it was mocked at.
Right,
So I
yes.
understood very early that this was not an acceptable way to think. But like a lot of children, I think I did have a very profound religious sense. And I did pray, and I was extremely ardent in my hymn singing. And I remember when I moved on to my secondary school, everybody went to church. I lied and pretended we went to church because I knew not to go to church would be to make me a social outcast. And I sort of felt that going to church is really where I ought to go. But it wasn't something I could do. I didn't ever tell my parents, not until I wrote Miss Garnett's Angel in the year 2000. And by this time, my mother had Alzheimer's.
Right.
So she couldn't, she was not quite poorly enough not to know I'd written a book. And she claimed to have read it, but I don't think she could have done. But not till I wrote Miss Garnett's Angel, and not till it was published in 2000. I wrote it in 1998. Did they have any idea I had any religious sympathy?
And was this when you were writing it, was there a sense of a sort of confession of religious sort of sympathy that was going on in there?
I don't know. Confession? No, I don't think confession actually, because there's a lot about the Jews in it as well. It's not a specifically religious book, Christian book. It's religious, but not. It's about religion, and the Archangel Raphael, who's the sort of central figure, was in fact a Zoroastrian figure that the Jews brought back from their exile in Babylon. In fact, the idea of angels comes from the Zoroastrians. The Jews brought it back after their exile in Babylon, and it got sort of transferred into the Christian religion. So it's a much older religious symbol, the angel. So the book was more about religion, but it is about a woman who starts as a communist, and her life experiences crack open those prejudices or those reserves. And she accepts a wider view of life. So I think it was a kind of declaration more than a confession. I mean, I wasn't ashamed of it.
No.
I just didn't really want to get into a thing with it with my parents.
Yes.
Although I do remember some years earlier having an argument with my mother about the parable of the labourers in the vineyard.
Okay. That being paid different amounts.
Being paid different amounts. And the first shall be last. And the ones who come late in the day get the same amount of money. And my mother said, I think it's a ridiculous parable. And it just shows the whole thing is ridiculous. And I said, why not? It's good trade union policy. Which shut her up. So I think it was quite an easy transition, you see, into...
You know, that William Morris. Ruskin. What did I say, Morris? Ruskin book. Unto the last, or something like that.
Unto this last, he wrote.
It's about that.
It's about that parable, yeah.
That's right. Wonderful.
Yeah. So those sort of radical and people like William Blake, who I was a great devotee of, those kind of radical Christians very much spoke to me.
So there's a mystical element, and then there's a sort of Blake is I guess a classic in this. A mystical element, but there's still a radical, world transforming type of aspect.
And I think both of those things attracted me to the. I think my idea of Christianity, anyway, and you and I know that there are many ways of looking at Christianity, and you and I have both come to quite eccentric views of Christianity, I think. But I think it combines the social, undoubtedly.
Yes.
With the mystical, and that's a combination that I found attractive, and it was the mystical I missed in my upbringing. I mean, I remember reading C.S. Lewis, the Narnia books, because they were given to me by a wonderful librarian who was the inspiration for my latest novel, The Librarian, which is about a children's librarian.
Waterstone's Book of the Month in November.
Yeah, well, that's another story.
Sorry, I've distracted you. I wanted to give it a plug.
It's nice of you to give it a plug, but Waterstones were very dictatorial about how the book should be presented.
Oh, really?
Well, the hardback was utterly beautiful, and the paperback. Well, never mind. I'm very grateful. But anyway, it's about a children's librarian, and it's really a testament to the children's librarian who gave me the books that really have fed my writing life and my interest. Starting with C.S. Lewis, which my parents would have had 40 fits. I had no idea it was about Christianity. None at all. And I think lots of children don't. It's not till I've read it later that I've realised that he's plugging away a bit. But it's a wonderful book.
I don't think people realise Harry Potter's about Christianity as well. Which I think it is, all that sacrificial stuff. And people read it and And it's not in the same way that
Well,
C.S. Lewis is.
to be
but...
honest, I've not read Harry Potter.
Oh, you should, Sally.
Well, I've only watched the films, you see, because I watched them with Rowan.
Okay, well, we'll have to come
And
back
I'm
to this.
essentially a Pullman fan more than a
Yes,
Rowan.
yes, that's all right too. That's good. This is both and. Sorry, I interrupted you. There's too much to say here.
Well, in the books she showed me, there was first of all that, but the two very important ones. One was George MacDonald, who you know was a radical minister and a real eccentric. And he was really famous for his adult fiction when he was writing, but his children's books are much less read nowadays, but still quite popular in the 50s when I was growing up. The Princess and the Goblin, The Princess and Curdie, but the one I really loved, At the Back of the North Wind, which is about a boy who's dying. But the interesting thing is, as a child, you don't know that's what's happening. You kind of know it and you don't know it at the same time.
Right.
And it's got a very strong mystical element, which is somehow one's unconscious can take it in while one's conscious mind is not understanding what's going on. And that really fed and nourished a part of me that my parents, for all their excellence and excellent moral values and excellent social values, they really didn't have that. And that's really what I had to acquire for myself.
It's interesting to try and work out what it is that, I mean, because I share quite a lot of the politics, not the same, but something of that politics.
No, I know we
and
do.
so forth.
We do.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
But that there is this sort of something that you really can't quite get at within the language just of the left, within the language of politics. That there is a sort of there is something out of the corner of behind your eye you can't quite see, which this world is not conclusion type. How does that wonderful poem end? Narcotics cannot still the tooth that nibbles at the soul.
Yes. Yes. Well,
there's something that nibbles at the soul, isn't
something
there?
that nibbles at the soul. I think. Well, it's my quarrel with humanism, actually. I mean, people say, well, there's nothing in Christianity that isn't in humanism, or Judaism that isn't in humanism. But I think there is. There is this sense of something more powerful than any of us. And I think if you take the human being, even at his or her best and finest, as your measure, you are missing out on a vast, imponderable and unknowable. I mean, I've just been reading the new translation of St. Augustine's Confessions, which is a book I'm very fond of, and all psychoanalysts like the Confessions for rather obvious reasons. And I've got a big quarrel with Augustine because I don't like the idea of original sin. I'm much more in favour of the orthodox tradition, which says we have an aptitude for sin, a propensity to sin, but we're not tainted from birth. So I've got this big quarrel with Augustine. But I do think his idea of God as the thing that lies behind all our other desires, because it allows for the desiring, which I think is part of the human condition, which is why I'm not a Buddhist. I think to remove desire is to remove some essential spark.
I agree.
In the human.
Yeah, I agree. I'm the same.
Some essential energy.
Yeah.
But the thing about Augustine is he doesn't do away with desire, but he perceives the desire as for something that is ultimately unknowable. And there's something very important to me about that, because it takes the weight off us somehow. It allows for.
But that's what original. Sorry, I'm going to have an argument with you about original sin because I'm much more fan of original sin.
You're a fan of original sin.
Well, it's because so I think it's had a bad press, original sin. So I think original sin is often, all about, aren't you naughty sexual beings? You're imbued with something.
No, I don't think that.
Okay. I mean, what I quite like about it is, and I suppose I feel this about myself really, but that we are sort of fundamentally broken in some way, and that we're in need of fixing, and that we're not good self-fixers, and that something about that fixing requires the not obvious intervention, but the sort of movement that comes from outside to me.
An infusion.
There's a lovely word. It requires an infusion of something. So I am dependent upon that which is outside my control. And that for me is like that I suppose that's where desire comes from.
Well, I think that's the Augustine position, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, if you go back to that story of the garden, which I think is a great story, one I wouldn't mind writing myself. The so-called sin is to eat from the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And I think that's really interesting because it's the moment when human beings start to say what's right and wrong. And I think the point is it's not really for us to decide ultimately what's right or wrong. It's for something larger.
We're exceeding our pay grade, as it were.
I think we're exceeding our pay grade. And I think that's the point. It's not that they are punished by being sent out of the Garden of Eden. It's that they have to go once they arrogate to themselves the decision about what's right and wrong. Because in my view, that's where most harm comes from human beings. Their belief they are right about what's right and wrong.
Yeah.
But you see, the story does allow for them having been whole before that moment, before they're broken. I mean, I agree about the broken. And I think that's where the Orthodox tradition is kinder and feels to me truer, that there is a wholeness within us that we lose when we step out into as the shades of the prison house begin to draw about us, that we lose. That's when the brokenness begins.
And this is, I suppose, also where it goes back to your mum's condition and, you wanting to be a healer, as it were.
Yes,
from quite,
I very much did want to be a healer, yeah.
From quite early on. And this sense of, these things all play together, don't they? Which it's, and I can see why you end up, seeking your healing vocation through writing and trying to describe what the human condition is like and what people are like and how silly and foolish we are and how wonderful we are and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I was talking the other day about the librarian, and a man came up to me afterwards because I was explaining how I came to write the book and how my parents had been very bookish but actually very poor because Dad was out of work because he was a communist and lost 2 jobs. So we had to go to the library, though I think we'd have gone anyway. And that's how I managed to get books that they wouldn't otherwise have given me.
I see.
And he asked me, he said, how has your leftist leanings affected your writing? And I thought a bit, and I said, well, I do write about the dispossessed and people on the hinterland and people who are broken. And, I mean, I'm not unusual in that. I mean, I think most writers are more interested in the broken than the so-called whole. But I think that's where my focus is. And how, through being broken, you can, in fact, have more access to a wider vision of life and a wider understanding that, I mean, I'm not a Pollyanna. I don't think all the bad things that happen to people are necessarily in the end good for them.
Yes.
But I think that if you're working in any kind of healing profession, you have to have a notion that what is broken can not so much be mended, but give access to a wider, richer vision of life and a richer understanding and a richer relationship. So I think that's where the business of psychoanalyzing people and the business of writing about people comes in.
I mean, I think it's when I feel like it's true in my own life as well. Actually, is that the broken bits are the bits where you feel that you grow in ways you never thought you were able to grow or capable of things.
Because you wouldn't want to. You wouldn't.
No. Why would you go
why
there?
Why would you want to?
Well, that horrible stuff that at St
Yes.
Paul's and that I went through and so forth,
Dreadful,
which I hated. I mean,
Yeah, well, I remember you at the time.
and it was horrible and painful and I sort of went through a sort of, I suppose, some sort of collapse after it, whatever. But and you wouldn't wish that on anyone, really.
No.
But I couldn't be the person I am now or feel that without having gone through any of that. So, those sorts of breakages are, and you spend your life holding your hands with people as they go through those breakages, which is why it's such a.
Well, I don't anymore. I only
you
write
have
now.
done.
I have done. Although I do feel a sort of responsibility for my characters as well. I mean, it's a silly thing to say because they aren't flesh and blood, and in one sense they're not real, but they are also real. And
Archetypes. You're a Jungian, aren't you? That's your...
I'm a Jungian by training, yes.
Yeah, okay.
I have quite a lot of quarrels with Jung, but
Right.
I probably won't have time to go into those. As a character, I prefer Freud as a man, but
Yes.
yeah, I am a Jungian, I suppose. I do have archetypes. The Archangel Raphael's an archetype. God's an archetype in Mr. Golightly's Holiday. But
The
I think
librarian must be an archetype of some sort.
yes, she probably is. But the children she affects are not, and they are like real children.
Okay.
And I do suffer for them. And when things don't go right for them, and for one of these three children that I write about, when some things don't go right, I kind of mind. And you might say, well, I could make that better because I'm her author, but in a way I'm not. And I suppose that's, if you believe in that sort of God, that's how that sort of God would feel about his creation.
Wow, that's really interesting. You just couldn't write the happy ending for some people because
No.
it just wouldn't be, I don't know, this isn't going to be the right way of putting it, but true to who they are, or there isn't any sense of realism about that. I mean, presumably, so what you're saying is you have to be, you actually have a responsibility to be extremely realistic about your characters.
I have a responsibility to give them free will. And all those arguments about free will and God.
That's
and,
really weird because you're writing them. I mean, I'm saying
I
the
know.
obvious thing here,
I know,
but
but
you're
this
giving
is-
them free will.
But this is the analogy with God.
Yes,
I
it
mean,
is. Yes, I can see
I'm
that.
sorry to take on this grandiose.
No.
This grandiose.
I knew this was an important interview, but I didn't think it was that important.
Well,
I'm in the presence of God.
I don't really think of God as a writer myself, although that was the point of Mr. Golightly's Holiday, that he was a writer and he was rewriting his great work, and that was the joke. But yeah, if you give your characters free will, they have to evolve in their own way. And I think in almost every book there's been a character whose life has not ended as happily as he or she might want, and there's nothing I could do about it. And that's a very odd feeling. If you start to fiddle about and meddle, it doesn't work.
Well,
I mean, it might be more a commercial book. And I did have a rather unhappy experience with my last book when my editor said she was disappointed that one particular relationship didn't end well. I mean, she didn't try and make me change it, but she said she found it was a pity. And I said, I know it is a pity, but that's how it is. I said, I'm sorry too.
There's it's very interesting what it is that you can do in a novel that you can't do in any other sort of form. You know, that there are ideas you can get at. There are things that you can explore in a novel that can't be explored in a newspaper article or even a long, you know, a non-fiction work. There's something that you can get there, which is when, I mean, it feels to me like, you know, everyone's allowed to have their say from different perspectives. You don't have to resolve the perspectives. You don't have to come to the great conclusion to which the argument all points, which is life, you know. And I sort of, and as somebody who's often conflicted about things and contradictory about things, I always quite like seeing the unresolved nature of the novel. But that's maybe that's what is it about the novel that I mean, other than you being good at it and all that sort of stuff.
I think the main thing about the novel for me, I was listening to you and trying to think what it is about the novel. I think for me the main thing about the novel, and what I get from people who write to me about my books, is that you can get to know a character in a novel more closely than you can ever get to know a living human being. Because the author, if she or he is good enough, can give you what is going on in the consciousness of that person, and if they're really good, in the unconscious of that person, so that you can get clues about how they are unconsciously reacting or feeling, in a way that even in a very deep analysis, psychoanalysis, you will never get to know another human being. And I think for me, that has always been the important thing about the novel. that I feel I know the people in novels more truthfully and more, and with fewer of my own projections onto them.
That's, again, a godlike type of relationship.
It's a very special relationship, and I have a feeling that's why novels are important to people. I mean, when I was teaching literature, I used to say a great novel isn't something necessarily we understand. It understands us. So when you write about Anna Karenina or Emma in Jane Austen, when you read about them, or Pip in Great Expectations, you will recognise elements in your own relationship to the world, relationship to money, class, love, whatever. And I think it removes that existential loneliness from which we all suffer from. You know, that I think you understand very well. There's a sense in which I think we're all lonely. And
Yes.
I think what great fiction does is it produces a reality that reflects our own and with which we're in sympathy.
And it has the sort of weight of our own. You know, it has and so that novels exist so we're not lonely. I mean,
yes, and actually I would include plays as well. I mean, I used to talk to my students about Hamlet, and I used to say, I'd ask them this question: is Hamlet real? And there's a sense in which Hamlet is realer than you or me, because, you know, Hamlet's going to be there long after we're dead.
You see, I find this this may explain something about. I like reading plays, but I often don't like going to see plays performed.
No, I don't much.
So with Hamlet, there's a good example. I can, read Hamlet and imaginatively construct Hamlet, and then have a relationship about this sort of doubting, tortured, complex, very conflicted character. And yes, absolutely, vividly real. I find that something is subtracted from that when I see it on the stage.
No, I agree with you. And
unless it's Simon Russell Beale, or unless it's brilliant, but most of the time it's subtracted,
Yeah, I agree with you. And it's particularly Hamlet or King Lear. And, these are the ones that it's very, very hard to...
Prospero for me, actually.
Or Prospero, yes. I mean, I agree with you about that. No, I agree. But I think, to go back to the reality, there's a sense in which, Hamlet's not born. He just appears.
He's made.
He dies, but he wasn't born. But he's totally real.
Yes.
So what's real, you see?
Yes.
This is one of my big questions. What is real?
Yes.
What is real?
Yes.
Is what's happening here real?
Yes.
But between us, we've now got Hamlet, and he's pretty real, isn't he?
Yeah.
To both of us. So I think what...
People use. Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, you can.
But I'm always fascinated by the way in which fiction, the word fiction, is used as a derogatory term.
Like myth.
Like that's just a fiction. That's just a fiction.
Or
that's
just
some
a
sort
myth.
of fiction.
Yes.
Or if somebody wants to be rude to me on Twitter about what it is that I believe in, they'll call it a fiction.
Well, you're lucky they only call it that F word.
They call it worse than that. But nonetheless, that would be a word that people would use in this derogatory sense. And I mean, I think we live in times which are, very sort of empirically minded.
Very.
And I find myself out of sync with that sort of...
Totally out of sync, I am, yes.
Yeah. Well, we're good. Yeah. But when people say that about fiction, I think, well, I can't see that's any great. I'm not insulted by you. Well, some fiction is enormously true and great and wonderful.
This is my response. If somebody talks about myth, which is the other thing they do, that's a myth.
Yes.
Or fiction like that. I always say fiction is something that gives us the facts in a way that faction simply can't. Because faction comes with the bias of the teller. Whereas great fiction, I think, has that measure of objectivity, that lasts outside the writer's consciousness. And very often, and I mean, I don't put myself in a great writer category, but I put myself in a writerly category. Very often you don't know what you've done. You don't know what you've done. And somebody will say, but it was really interesting that, like in my book Cousins, which was the one before last, I have 3 women narrators of different ages. And somebody said to me, oh, are they the Nones, who are the Nordic spinners of fate? And I said, oh my God, they are the Nones.
All right.
But I
Right.
didn't sit down and think, oh, I know, I'll write a book with
Yes,
the
yes,
Nones
yes.
in it. It's just that, you know, my knowledge of the Nones, I had obviously got into these and got across to this guy's consciousness through some completely unconscious bridge.
I mean, I think one of my favourite writers really is Dickens. I mean, Dickens
Yes,
is
yes,
for
me
me
too,
a sort
yeah.
of, and you know, maybe I'm about to get in trouble with the bishop for saying this, but I think you know, Dickens.
I just think you're always in so much trouble that Dickens is hard again.
Well, no, I was going to say I really do think Dickens is the sort of author of Christmas. You know, I mean, there is.
Yes.
You know, there is a sort of.
We're Christmas caroling now, are we?
Well, I'm just, you know, this is probably going to go out just before Christmas, this one. So I quite like to just like have a sense of. I went to see at the Old Vic last year, Christmas Carol, with that Welsh actor. His name has escaped me. I was so excited and thrilled and expanded by going to see it for weeks afterwards. Actually, probably more than you know, the reading of the Gospels that I should have been. But you know, sometimes you can take something. I mean, you know, it seems to me to be the absolute meeting point of my faith and my something like Christmas Carol is the meeting point of my faith and my social conscience. And I adore this time of year. I'm not a humbug. I love Christmas. I think people are better at Christmas. I think there is a magical quality to Christmas. You're not a Christmas humbug, are you?
Absolutely not.
Oh, good.
And I love A Christmas Carol. And I'll tell you an interesting thing about this. Perhaps you know it, but I'll tell you anyway. He started that as a pamphlet, as a tract. He wrote a tract about the poor. And I think his publisher said, now, come on, Charles, this is a bit dry. You know, do you really want to write that? And then he turned it into a story. And look, you know, all this time later, you and I took my granddaughter Rowan, who you know, to the Stratford version of it, and my grandson Sam to the Stratford version of it. I love it. I love it. And I remember going to see it at the Stratford East Joan Littlewood production as a child. It's a fantastic story. And I think that whole story of a baby coming into the world is absolutely archetypally true. It's a new life. It produces a degree of adoration in the mother and tenderness in other people and a desire to give that whole story tells. I mean, I particularly love the Magi coming from the east following their star.
I guess the story of Christmas also is the sort of intersection between your literary and your theological interests.
Yes, I mean, as you know better than most, it's very unlikely that Jesus was born in December.
Or the 25th.
Certainly not the 25th. So it assimilates the whole pagan idea of the new year coming, the turning of the year. But I think that's what's great about those religious stories, that the great religious stories do assimilate the old beliefs, the old pagan beliefs, the notion of goodwill, the notion of the coming of the light, and our reliance on light. So the idea that coming of the light, the coming of the turning of the natural world, coincides with the birth of a baby, any baby, because any baby is the renewal of life. Any baby is a life that takes on life, that is handed on. Any baby brings, well, with luck, most babies bring that degree of adoration and tenderness and joy and giving and selflessness. And then to make that baby the baby that grows into a man who somehow turns the world around and turns all values on its head is a brilliant piece of storytelling. I mean, it is a story.
And terrifying as well. There's the you see, you can't do Christmas without that sense of threat.
You can't do Christmas without Easter.
Well, I mean, it's
Herod.
already there. I mean, my wife is pregnant. We went and had the scan the other day, and the first So the first view you have, this is a terrible thing to say, I think. The first view you have of my child, I don't even know if it's a boy or a girl, it's a skeleton.
Yeah.
It's the first thing you see. And I'm just like, the first thing I think of is like, the skeleton's associated with death.
Yes.
You know, and that birth, death type of thing.
Yes.
You get that in Christmas quite a lot, which is, you know, a sword will pierce your own heart too type of thing about the Annunciation to Mary, that there's, you know, this is a man who's born to die, and then the threat of Herod, and
it's
all
that
those
wonderful poem by T.S. Eliot.
yes,
The Coming of the Magi.
For the time, is it from For the Time Being, isn't it? It's in that collection. I think
I'm not sure what collections it's in, but it is a wonderful poem. And, you know, was it a birth or death we came for? And their way in which, I can't quote it, unfortunately.
Yeah,
but that Coming of the Magi is very much what you're talking about, the way in which is it a birth or is it a death? Because it is a death, of course, if you are a Christian.
Yeah.
You know, what Christ comes to say, it turns everything upside down with the Beatitudes and so on. And he's under threat of death, and we know he's going to die. So we know the end of that story. So when we rejoice at Christmas, we're rejoicing against the knowledge that this is not going to last. And I think it's that, too, that sort of temporary retreat from the normal anxieties of life, the sort of temporary sanctuary. That's what I was trying to think of.
And also a sort of an assertion of its an assertion of the sort of dominance of the light over the darkness.
Yes.
A sort of that through our holding the candle up, through our singing of carols, through our kneeling and praying, that there is a sort of a way of beating back the darkness through something joyous and.
No, I agree. I think it's an utterly, utterly joyous time, and there's no humbug at all.
I'm so glad I find it.
And I love carols.
Yes.
The holly and the ivy. And
communal singing of them as well.
Communal singing of carols. It's just fabulous. I mean, we used to go carol singing. I don't think you get that anymore, do you?
It's quite. We find it hard to get a quorat, you know, to go carol singing. And the pubs aren't that interesting. I remember a time when. In fact, back when I used to be the vicar of Putney, we used to be able to go round. When we first met. Yes, we used to go round and
with a lantern.
No, not with a lantern. but you know, you could do carol singing on the streets, and now it's that the Salley Army heroically sort of do their thing publicly, but it's harder to get people to go out, and it's harder to get an audience for it.
I don't think people sing the way they used to. I don't think they're singing the way they used to be. And I'll tell you another thing you don't get whistling anymore. Have you noticed?
I can't whistle.
No, but you might not whistle. But when you grew up, I bet people whistled.
Well, just whistling in the street?
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Walking down the street whistling.
People whistle.
People don't whistle.
People used to whistle while they were whistle while you work.
I can't whistle. I can whistle. I can't whistle. It would seem quite a weird thing to do, to walk down the street whistling. I don't know how we had this conversation.
Well, it came through Christmas.
Well, Salley Vickers, it's just a joy to sit here and talk to you and to learn all about your novels and your life. And as always, it's great pleasure and profit that I sit and talk to you. Thank you very much for coming and talking to me.
Thank you, Giles. It's lovely to be here.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Confessions with me, Giles Fraser. If you're enjoying the podcast, please do rate and review it, and do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. I'll be joined by another guest next week for another episode of Soul Bearing, and I do hope you'll tune in then. And do check out the website unheard.com.